Good evening, good evening. It is so nice that so many of you came today. I knew, of course, that there were sort of real fans of my guest, but also if you think it is so warm outside and there's football being played and all these kind of things. So welcome everyone to this talk tonight. We are talking about something that is very relevant in Britain, but also relevant in Austria. We are talking about the BBC under pressure and how public broadcasters should, can, may adapt to the challenges of the 21st century. And in order to discuss this, I'm very happy that I have a person here, a very special guest, Kirsty Lang. Welcome, Kirsty.
Thank you, Tessa. And I realise we are competing against the Euros.
We are.
I'm kind of amazed that my own husband has turned up, because I know he'd rather be watching the football.
That's a special thing, actually, but it's not Austria playing tonight, so for the Austrians among us, this is also, of course, makes a big difference. So we are talking with Kirsty Lang because she actually spent most of her career, or a lot of her career, in the BBC. As a journalist, as an anchor woman, as a former correspondent, although as a correspondent you were for the Sunday Times.
Also for the
mostly.
BBC.
Also for the BBC.
Yeah.
What year was that?
I was the correspondent in Budapest in the for a certain time, the fall of communism, and then I was a correspondent in Paris, and briefly in Moscow, and also sort of briefly in the former Yugoslavia, but at the beginning of the war. Yeah.
And then I've spent many, many hours watching you on the BBC News, reading news, and in different programs, but also as a presenter of one of my favorite Radio 4 programs, the Front Row, the cultural program. That was a time when Kirsty decided maybe politics, she's already expert enough, she does the whole cultural department too, which was really lovely for us because you are, of course, also a very wonderful stage and radio, voice, TV, and whatever presence. But then she also, of course, writes for the Sunday Times and for the Financial Times, where she has recently made the Vienna housing project famous. So it has not made her famous because she already is, but in the whole world now, people are copying her article, which appeared, I think, what, a year ago?
Yeah, a little bit longer than that. About
in the FT,
a year and a half
ago, where she described the social housing projects that the Red Vienna started 100 years ago, and which till today have quite positive effects. And I thought it was curious because it was during a time when it was published when the rents went up in Vienna, and in Vienna nobody had anything good to say about the social Wohnbau in Vienna. But in Britain, where the rents are completely crazy, especially in London, people thought like, that's the thing to do. And so people started copying Kirsty's article. And it's now sort of a staple. It's sort of the to-go-to article if you want to know something. So that's quite funny. And she wrote this article because she decided to come to Vienna to at least part-time live here, which we are very glad to have you, of course. You are also in some of the side jobs. I won't mention everything, but for example, you are also on the board of the environmental NGO Global Witness. And what you still do in the BBC, so she was looking for a job that she could combine in the BBC and also while she's actually supposed to spend some time with her husband Misha here in Vienna. So she's hosting the quiz show, Round Britain Quiz, which is one of the longest running quiz shows.
I think it is possibly the world's longest running quiz show. Yeah, it's been going for forever. The British really love quizzes. And when I took it over about 2 years ago, I said to the BBC, they made an announcement about it being the longest running quiz, and I said, I looked up all their previous presenters, and they were all men. And I said, why don't you say that I'm the first woman to present it, because that's sort of news. And they said, that's too embarrassing for us to admit.
It's true. But is it to do, because you have, you know, to be a quiz show master, you don't need to know all the answers, because you have the answers.
Yes.
But you need to be quick-witted in order also to get people...
It's a completely impossible quiz. I can't answer any of the questions, but my teams are kind of brilliant, but I have to give them clues as I have to sort of steer them along the way. Yeah. But, yeah.
If she says it's easy and she knows all the answers, it's because she's British. I have learned this the hard way at every pub quiz I've ever been to in London, that people are really masters in Britain in this quiz show thing. And if you think, because you played Trivial Pursuit with your children or with your friends, that you are okay, I won't challenge you on this, but you should really go to a pub quiz in London somewhere where people throw out answers at such a quick speed. And I was always sitting there thinking like, oh God, I know nothing, which is probably true anyway. Okay, to our subject, the BBC. I thought we should talk about the BBC because, of course, ORF has similar challenges. There are differences, but there's a broad overlying problem that all public broadcasters have nowadays. And so we wanted to develop a little bit the theme. Maybe we start with the structure, because we know more or less here what ORF is about, and to see if BBC is a similar beast. You know, for us, of course, the BBC was always, and for the whole world, sort of the mother of all TV stations, you know, the to-go-to model when you discuss television. And of course, if you ask anyone who works in the BBC or worked in the BBC, people are super, super critical all the time. And it sort of has always been better yesterday and it will never be good tomorrow. But can you give us a bit of an overview now where we stand there? Because the BBC, of course, has a huge responsibility and also a huge program, if you think of everything.
I mean, let me take you back to the beginning, I think, which is 1923. The BBC is founded as a commercial company. The British Broadcasting Company, I think it was originally. It's, you know, not long after the First World War. The world is in tumult. It's a very uncertain place. And suddenly this technology comes along, which allows people to experience things together for the first time. You know, hundreds of thousands of people can listen to a live concert. And then, of course, they can listen to the King speaking or the Prime Minister. And very quickly, it is realized that this is too important to leave to the commercial world, way too important to be left as a business, and also too important to be put in the hands of the state, of the government. And so in 1927, the British Broadcasting Corporation is founded, and it is owned by the citizens of Britain, for the citizens of Britain. And the idea is that it will be funded, and it still is to this day, by a license fee, which is collected by the BBC, not by the government, and in those days it was depending on whether you had a radio set, then it became a TV set. Now we have the online platform iPlayer. In order to access that, you must pay a license fee, which is now around, I would say, just under 200 euros per household a year. Now, the government can set the amount of money, which is how they kind of control things. It is governed by a board. 14 people sit on the board of the BBC. 5 people are appointed by the government. The chair, and then one person in charge of each region, each of our nations, England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland.
It was a little bit of a dangerous mistake to make, to call them regions.
Nations, I should have said nations, yeah. Each of our 4 nations. And then there are like 3 or 4 members of the executive who actually work full-time for the BBC, so the CEO and you know, head of programs, head of news, etc. And then there will be, I think there's another, 4 or 5 independent non-executive directors who come from different parts of broadcasting. Like one of them is an Italian TV maker who is on the board of RAI, for instance, at the moment. So there's a certain amount of independence is guaranteed through the board. But as I think we'll go on to discuss later, in the last 10 years, and particularly under the Boris Johnson government, this has come under extreme pressure, where there have been real attempts to undermine the independence of the BBC. Not the first time a government has done this, as we'll talk about, but that's kind of the situation. And so for just under €200 a month, and I've got to check this because I've written it down, I forget how much, but the scope of the BBC is absolutely huge. So for that you get, where have I written it down? But you get something like 8 television stations, 8 national TV channels, including regional services, and I mean regional services, not national ones. You get 2 kids channels, CBBC, which is for young children, CBeebies, which is for really young children, babies. You get a parliamentary channel, you get a news channel, and you have BBC 3, which is aimed at young adults. So it really, and this is important because there's a universality to the BBC, that it is supposed to serve all of the population of Britain. Then you have 10 national radio stations, 40 local stations, and then the World Service, which is broadcast outside of the United Kingdom. And then you have the online services, obviously the website, which I think is one of the most read websites in the world. And you have BBC apps, you have food, weather, etc. And all of that for about €15 a month, per household or something like this. It's pretty reasonable per person. Sorry. Yeah.
It's quite similar, actually, to the situation here, in the sense that it's about €15 per month, and you get the old television, but you get all the modern services as well. And you have a website, which here, there was a big debate recently about the Blaue Seite, which is sort of the news website, which actually really had a very good overview. The colleagues from the Standard were not always happy about that, because they have that too. It's like the Guardian also is sort of the to go to for free if you don't support them, which we all should. Standard has a similar model. And the big broadcasting website, of course, feed already on a lot of the content that they have, and can also draw a lot of traffic to them. And the question was always if that is fair to the writing profession to have this extra service for free.
Well, this has always been the big debate in Britain, and indeed the Murdoch press, and of course Rupert Murdoch owns a substantial number of our newspapers, very influential, has campaigned for years and years against the BBC beak. I mean, he'd like to see it abolished, precisely because of that. And once, is that they feel that the BBC is giving away journalism, for nothing, and therefore undermining the commercial model. So there has always been that tension. Now, the BBC, I think, is the only public service broadcaster in Europe that does not take any advertising. And there's quite a lot of debate about whether it should take some advertising. And now with digital and the streamers taking advertising, there's not very much advertising money to go around. And the feeling is, that the commercial broadcasters would be very against the BBC taking any advertising, because obviously it would take money away from them. So it would impact on the quite delicate, very fragile media ecosystem that exists.
That's really also a big difference to the situation here, because ORF for long years has advertising, which is, we are totally used to it. It's very nice in the BBC that you don't get disturbed by outside ads and only by internal kind of advertisement for BBC programs. But the question for me was always like, okay, you can make a little bit of money on that, and it would be better for the BBC to open up, but it was sort of a little bit of a holy cow issue. in British circles to suggest something wildly sort of pedestrian like that.
I don't think, I mean, look, it's great having channels where you've got no advertising. And I think it's also particularly important for the children's channels, that they're not fed all this rubbish, you know. I don't think the BBC's squeamish per se about the idea of taking advertising, but as I say, it's more that there would be a lot of resistance from the commercial sector. One of the things the BBC is looking at now is, you know, so if you like, the long tail. So having advertising, perhaps getting some money from advertising when the BBC has a programme that say it's a new drama, for instance, and you have it available for like 2 months, but after 2 months you start to put a bit of advertising in, sort of, you know, delayed. I mean, that's one of the things that's under consideration. Because the BBC has lost something like 43%, the 43% cut in its income since 2010, since the Conservatives won in 2010. It's huge. And that is a combination of factors. One, they froze the license fee, but then there were two really other big factors. One was that the BBC World Service, which is our overseas network that can only be heard outside of the United Kingdom. This is television and radio. That used to be paid for directly by the government, by the Foreign Ministry. And under the Conservatives, under a former finance minister, George Osborne, basically that was given to the BBC. So they had to take that cost on. The other really big thing was that under the previous Labour government, under Gordon Brown, Prime Minister up until 2010, they introduced a free licence fee for over 75s. Now, this was a social benefit borne by the government. But when the Conservatives came in, they said the BBC must now provide free licence fees for people of over 75. Now, that population of people over 75 is growing. This is effectively a kind of blank cheque that they forced the BBC to sign with a gun to its head. And you know, I sincerely believe that there are quite a lot of people within the Conservative government, more sort of populist right-wing elements, that sought to undermine the BBC by starving it of funds. I do think. I mean, that is a suspicion. We don't have proof for it, but you know, obviously, it is a suspicion because it's made the BBC. It's you know, the BBC. I think it's one of the most respected broadcasters in the world. We make world-class dramas, programs, which we do sell, so it's quite a big commercial operation. A lot of BBC programs then get show. I mean, I'll name drop my husband, Misha Glenny, who you'll know, but he wrote a book called McMafia about organised crime, and that was made into a very successful BBC drama about a Russian oligarch family in London. And that was then sold on to Netflix and Amazon. And this is the case with many, many BBC dramas. So the commercial wing is pretty successful, but there's a limit to how much money.
But it's also, we should mention that the BBC can sell its programs to commercial stations, but is not supposed to be a profit organization. It's non-profit because it reinvests in its own...
It has to reinvest within its own programming.
And that's the same thing here.
Yeah.
So you're not supposed to be a moneymaker for profit for the, I don't know, shareholders, but it is
well, the shareholders of the British public.
It's the British public, so it has to go, but directly in the thing. I mean, that's, I think, important to mention because, of course, private TV stations have a completely different setting, which also influences the quality of programs often, because of course it's easier to sell, stuff that doesn't challenge the public as much as some of the public broadcasters do with their program. But it's quite interesting what you were saying, that about sort of the general theme of political influence. It's, of course, every public broadcaster has this problem. the question is, in my view, a lot about how the culture in a country is, how people deal with their public broadcasting companies, and how the journalists who work there deal with the pressure that might come from the government. And so maybe you can give us a bit of an overview, because you mentioned Boris Johnson, and we'll come back to that, but it started much earlier with influence attempts from governments.
Yes, I mean, I think that the governments have always sought to influence the BBC. So I joined the BBC in the mid to late 1980s as a graduate trainee. I'd studied politics at the London School of Economics, and then did a 2-year training course as a graduate trainee. At that time, one of the places I was sent to train was Northern Ireland, because there was still a civil war there, and it was considered a very good training ground for journalists.
Get a young journalist really.
It was highly competitive to get to Northern Ireland, so everybody wanted to go. Because obviously, if you're a young journalist, that's where you wanted to be. And at that time, Thatcher was Prime Minister, and she was constantly clashing with the BBC. So, for instance, around, I think it was in 1988, she introduced a law that said you cannot broadcast the words of terrorists. In other words, you can't put members of the IRA or Sinn Féin or, on TV or radio, actually, for that matter. Now, this was a huge issue for the BBC. I mean, I remember going on my first strike. It's sort of one of many, I think, over the years I've been at the BBC. But we went on strike that it was a sort of symbolic 2-day strike or something over this, because, of course, particularly for the World Service, this was an issue because the British government was telling other governments all around the world they didn't agree with censorship. And then we're censoring people ourselves. So the BBC and other broadcasters found a way around this. We would use actors' voices. So you would see a member of Sinn Féin on television, like a fish, and then an actor's voice would say whatever Jerry Adams from Sinn Féin was saying, and then you had to put a little thing saying, these words are voiced by an actor. So the whole thing was completely farcical. And that went on for about 5 or 6 years, and eventually I think the major government got rid of it because it was embarrassing, and we had entered the days of the peace negotiations, so that was part of it. And then I think the next time experienced real government interference was under the Labour government of Tony Blair, and that was when the BBC brought out a report questioning the claims of the Blair government that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which of course we all now know there weren't any. But in about 2003, the BBC started reporting this, and it was a massive row. I mean, I remember working in the newsroom then, and you would have Tony Blair's right-hand man, Alistair Campbell, ringing up all the time, screaming down the phone,
Not his finest hour,
yeah.
Probably, he would think today.
So there was that. And then...
No, but how did that work? So they said, report this. People in the newsroom said, but there's no confirmation. And Alistair Campbell would shout, you still report it, and you did?
Well, the trouble is it's a very long, complicated story. The reporter who reported it didn't want to name his source. It was eventually revealed that it was one of the weapons inspectors, a man called David Kelly, who I think committed suicide. It was quite tragic, I think, because was exposed as the source. And later on, there was a government inquiry. The director of the BBC resigned. I mean, it was a very tense time. But in the end, of course, the BBC was right. We were right. There weren't no weapons of mass destruction. And then I would say that then the next time that the BBC really starts to clash with the government is over the Brexit referendum, which I think is almost existential for the BBC. This becomes very, very difficult. And I don't think the BBC, it's difficult, but I don't think they handled it very well. And part of this is down to this, it is hardwired into every BBC journalist that we must be balanced and impartial. So what this meant during the Brexit referendum was that they tried to give equal time to, you know, those people who wanted to remain in the EU and those people who wanted to exit. Well, those people who wanted to exit were people like Nigel Farage, who was unelected. I mean, he was an MEP, but he'd never been elected to the British Parliament. And you essentially had two wings of the Conservative Party fighting each other, and that was the balance. You would have one remain, one leave. And this was very difficult because the British population was famously, still is, the most ill-informed population about how Europe works than any other country in Europe. I mean, I can't tell you, I mean, I was somebody who studied the EU at university, so, you know, I know quite a lot about its, you know, the boring details of how it works. Most British people have absolutely no idea how it works.
Here, to be honest. I don't think people
No, I tell you that it's even worse. I mean, and so it became very easy for those leavers to just lie. And so I'll give you an example. During the Leave campaign, they had this famous bus. You probably heard about this in Austria. You know, 387 million, blah, 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 you know, which said taking away from you and it could be paying for our health service. Now, when the BBC, as they should do, challenged or attempted to challenge this assertion, they were accused of being biased.
Yeah.
And this would happen. So, so it was constantly under attack. And that sort of continued since. I mean, during this present election, the campaign that we're having now, there is almost no discussion about the long-term effects of Brexit because everyone's too frightened to mention it, including the BBC. So, you know, BBC journalists, it's like nobody wants to touch that, you know, that electric fence again. They stay away from it. And this is, you know, I had an example just a couple of years after Brexit, or I think actually in the year after Brexit became official, we'd left the European Union, and I was presenting a culture program on the radio, as Tessa mentioned, and I was interviewing the head of the Royal Opera House in London, and it was about the reopening after the pandemic, and we're talking about, you know, theatres reopening. And then I said to him, of course, you still have the difficulty, now you have the difficulty of Brexit, which was disastrous for musicians, particularly classical musicians and opera singers, because suddenly, you know, if you're the Royal Opera House in London and your mezzo-soprano gets a sore throat and that night, before you could just ring up, you know, I don't know, Amsterdam or Vienna or whatever and say, can you get somebody over, a first violinist or a, you know, soprano over, and they could fly up. Now you can't. Now they have to have a visa, they have a work permit, it can't be done. So it's disastrous for orchestras, absolutely disastrous. And so we then had this discussion. Well, I got a memo from one of my bosses afterwards saying, you should not have raised the Brexit issue. If your guest raises it, that's okay, but you shouldn't raise it. Because, you know, and this is indicative. I mean, of course, I gave a somewhat robust answer to that, which I will not repeat here. But this is how frightened they got. The feeling was, don't poke the angry bear in Downing Street, in the Prime Minister's office, because otherwise we'll be in even more trouble.
It's also because, of course, Brexit went so wrong. I mean, in Austria, in Vienna, we call this a Rohrkrepierer, a barrel burst. It's not nicely translated into this, it's a much nicer. The Rohrkrepierer is a much nicer expression in the Austrian dialect, which means basically sort of it went so wrong in its initial stages already, that basically maybe if it would have worked, people in the government wouldn't have been so nervous then afterwards to discuss the pros and cons. But since there's not a single positive effect of Brexit, and they still have to win elections on the agenda, they won the last elections, which was having Brexit delivered. So they are probably quite nervous about this now.
Hey, we did the EU a favour, right? I mean, everybody stopped talking about leaving after that. You know, Marine Le Pen, Giorgia Meloni, you all looked at Britain and went, whoa, don't want to go down that road.
Yeah, initially, yes, but look what happens now. I mean, it's a big irony to me to think that the country that is now possibly electing a social democratic government is the country that left the EU. So if Brexit Britain elects Labour while Europe is having big trouble to get the far-right gains in elections locally, nationally and on EU level under control, the irony is not lost on us, I must say.
I mean,
but anyway.
I mean, one thing I think we should really, going back to the sort of issue, one always gets distracted by the Brexit discussion.
Yes.
I mean, I think a really, really key thing in the discussion of why is public broadcasting so important now? You know, and the reason is because we are flooded with disinformation now. The traditional model of journalism has collapsed. We've not, with the internet, we have not found alternatives for it. Advertising income is shrinking, and there is so much toxic rubbish in the digital sphere that we have, you know, I like to think of it as an ecosystem, as an ecology, like the biome in your stomach, right? There is so much bad bacteria out there. We have to have decent journalism. And frankly, only publicly funded broadcasters like the BBC can afford to have decent winning. I think the BBC has one of the biggest news gathering operations in the world of any broadcaster. But that's under threat now because we can't because our income is shrinking. Meanwhile, the Russians have, you know, quadrupled how much they spend on Russia Today and so on. I mean, I looked up these figures actually before this. Is that in 2014, the amount of money that Russia spent broadcasting outside the country and the World Service had a sort of similar amount of money, and let's say around 300 million euros a year or whatever. You know. Now, the Russians are spending $1.5 billion on Russia Today. The Chinese are building broadcasting stations in African countries and former British colonies, you know, where the British used to support the local broadcasters, and that's now gone. So, you know, this is a real, and the Kremlin are quite open about it. They see information as a weapon, and disinformation as a weapon.
But it's quite interesting, that point that you're making there, because since Russian and Chinese influence in Africa, for example, is built up through these networks, because RT is actually, you know, we don't watch it here if we ever have anymore, because it's actually not on anymore. You know,
that doesn't, forget whether RT is on terrestrial, it's on digital, it's on YouTube, it's on Facebook, it's on, you know, that's how a lot of young people watch their news. With clips, right? Without even noticing sometimes where it comes from. But the interesting thing for me there is also that what you said is the World Service was there and RT was there, and it might now be reversed because, and that's one of the big problems of all these attempts in Britain to lower the budget for the BBC, is that the World Service is not there in large parts of the world just to have a kind of neutral, impartial information service anymore. So that's one thing that we should also tell governments maybe, because as you have the BBC World Service, you have, for example, Deutsche Welle, which is broadcasting in English and not in German anymore, because it's precisely for that reason there to sort of present a position of a democratic European country, Germany plus the EU, sort of, to also influence what's happening in publics that might not have reliable news sources otherwise.
And the problem, of course, is Deutsche Welle doesn't have the same reputation as the BBC does, and it doesn't have the same budget as Chinese and Russian broadcasting, international broadcasting services are built up to.
And then you've got the, another big threat to public broadcasting is the rise of the streamers, the Netflixes, the Amazons, Disneys, because they have, big tech has huge resources. And the cost of making a TV drama has gone up hugely in recent years. And part of that is the competition, a lot of that's competition from the streamers. So the BBC can no longer afford to make a big TV drama on its own. Because a lot of the big streamers will come and make, programs in the UK and everything. Okay, it's great, there's lots of jobs and so on. But it does make it more difficult for the public broadcasters to compete, so you have that. And we haven't even got on to AI. I mean, just wait till that's going. Then you really won't know what's out there on the internet once AI gets into the game properly.
That's, of course, a question that everyone has to answer. The BBC, ORF, everyone in public broadcasting, and everyone who wants to counter this huge, the big tech threat to information and to income. So now the European Union, of course, has tried with the Digital Services Act and the Digital Management Act to get this initially under control, to see, to force big tech also to face their responsibilities. But that is, of course, everything happens so quickly that I wouldn't think that this is enough. So where can a company like the BBC that doesn't underlie the EU regulations in any case, and also the big tech in Britain, not necessarily, but it's fairly aligned. But what is a possibility to counteract it, to make them pay taxes in Britain, to,
Well, I personally think that, we have to find, and I know the EU is really trying hard, but we have to find ways of regulating big tech more. And I think, there was the Australian government passed a law a few years back forcing Google to fund a certain amount of local journalism. I mean, the fact is that Google, steals the stuff that the Guardian or whatever and the BBC writes, anything that's not behind a paywall, and puts it out there for free. They have undermined traditional journalism, and they're not paying for it, and they should be made to pay for it, I think. I think the other thing that actually public broadcasters should get better at is, and certainly the BBC is a fantastic brand. Let's face it, it's a global brand that stands for quality. And yet a lot of, it's not uncommon to turn on Netflix, see a program that was actually made by the BBC, I know is an original BBC drama, and it'll say, this is a Netflix original. And that's just because the BBC is not really very good at branding. I mean, everything should be branded. This is a BBC original. Don't allow that. BBC has got to be more assertive about its branding. I mean, certainly, I'm sure lots of people when McMafia went out thought it was a Netflix original. No.
I'm still waiting for season 2, that, of course.
So I think that public broadcasters need to be more assertive. I think we need to lobby governments more to be on our side. I mean, I don't think there'll be no discussion in the British election at the moment about the BBC. There won't be. It's not a big enough issue. And this is a concern because when you look at opinion polls and you ask most people in Britain, do you think you should pay a license fee? They say, no, of course, nobody's going to say, yes, I want to pay 200 euros a month. A year, sorry. A year. They want to, so people will come out, the opinion polls will show more people in favour of a subscription model. Well, if the BBC went over to subscription, it would cease to exist as the BBC because you couldn't have the universality of it. It would become very expensive.
But so basically what you're saying, and and I think it would be very important to make this point also, is to governments, and we have seen this now since the rise of populism has had a big impact on Britain, but also on Austria. And you immediately saw how populism goes hand in hand with attacks on the public broadcasters, precisely because populist politicians and governments don't have a big interest in an impartial and independently an editorial thinking of journalists that they need to be critical towards their power. And so they attack it instead of supporting it, and instead of pointing out how important it is that you have news that you can trust, no matter if the Prime Minister is from the left or from the right, but in the principles of a democratic society with its institutions, it is a big asset to have. And so we should actually call on governments to make clear that they also, in their political programs, have a clear commitment to this, which we don't, not in Britain and not necessarily in Austria. It depends a little bit in the differences between parties.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I think that the conversation on disinformation, I mean, I think we're having more and more conversations about the danger of disinformation to democratic societies, but it is not high enough off the agenda. And the trouble is once organizations like the BBC are destroyed, you'll never be able to recreate them. It's just not going to happen. You know, we have watched the collapse. You know, in my lifetime, I've seen the collapse of good journalism in newspapers and so on, and it's extremely depressing.
But don't tell us this, please, because we here sit and we watch BBC and we read the Financial Times or the Guardian and other papers, and we actually think highly of you.
Well, yes. I mean, look, you know, the good fight is still going on, but the fact is that, I mean, when I have young journalists coming to see me in Britain, or aspiring young journalists going, you know, I'd like to become a journalist like you, I go, well, if you're prepared to be really poor and have lots of job insecurity, it's not a great career. Whereas for my generation, it was a great career. I mean, I made loads of money, but I had a decent lifestyle, you know, and that's very, very difficult now. And the collapse of local journalism, I think, has been terrible for our democracies. Nobody holds local government to account anymore in many countries around the world. You see this in the United States. It's just disastrous. In fact, I'm always struck when I go to America how many Americans watch BBC news or read the website or the Guardian because that doesn't have a paywall. I mean, it's really striking.
And it's also decent.
And it's decent.
And it's not sort of a kind of unclear where does it come from.
But both the BBC and the Guardian are under huge pressure, and their journalists are very badly paid.
But let's think a little bit one more step on the question how government interference happens in a public broadcaster. Because, of course, we have seen it at the height of Boris Johnson's government. I remember on the day after the election when he won with this big majority, the Conservative Party, they were triumphant. And I remember Charles Moore, who was a British Conservative journalist, came on air in the BBC and he said, and this is the beginning of your end. He didn't say it in these words, but this was the crackdown on the power of this BBC, the institution which had always been perceived as being a left-wing television sort of monster against the Conservatives, that they would crack down on it. And I thought, like, wow, because we were in the middle of it at the time in Austria, where the black and turquoise coalition, so conservative and far right together in coalition, were making exactly the same threats. And the ways how to go about it, one thing, as you already mentioned, was the license fee. Same debate here. Here there is this plan that the FPÖ also still has in their drawers and very happy to pull out again, is to take away the license fee and have ORF be financed directly through the budget of the government, which would mean that, of course, the leash would become a lot shorter, because you can always say, like, no, this year we only have 500 million left.
And also, I mean, I should say the BBC licence fee is set for 10 years. Now, this gives any organisation a huge advantage if you have 10 years guaranteed funding, because you could do long-term planning. If it was funded out of tax, it would be very difficult to get that kind of deal. So that would undermine it. Yeah, you're right. I mean, they really, at the beginning, they went right in. I think the pandemic actually helped public broadcasters, because what was really noticeable during the pandemic was that, and I think you can see this across Europe, was people turned to public broadcasters as a trusted source of information. And that, you know, that made it more difficult for them to attack the BBC, because suddenly everybody was watching the BBC. I mean, the differences in audience between the BBC and commercial news during that time were huge. And the same in I know in Italy it was the same, and I think it was same here in France. People in times of crisis, people turn to their public broadcaster.
Yeah, and then I think you're totally right with the credibility issue, and then also populism in Britain sort of got a little bit of a dip because Boris Johnson left office. Now it's a little bit less heated, the debate. So Rishi Sunak's government was not super on top of this particular issue. And if a Labour government comes in, do you expect the licence fee debate not to be reopened? I mean, they haven't really tackled this issue very much.
I mean, it's an interesting question. You don't see it mentioned in the manifestos, obviously. The next negotiation for the licence fee will be 2027, so it's not far off. The leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, is very much wooing the Leave vote. These are the working class voters who were Labour, then voted Leave, and then went to Boris Johnson in the last election. I think it's unlikely that the Labour Party will undermine the BBC further. A Labour government, I don't think it would really be in their interests. And to be honest, I think the current Conservatives realise it wasn't in their interest. It's not, you know, I think it was popular with a sort of far-right cabal. But actually, for the public, I think the public, on the whole, don't want to, you know, are fond of the BBC. 90%, I think, of all Britons engage with the BBC on some level every week. So I don't think it would be popular. I think the BBC would be naive to expect a big injection of cash, because I think there are going to be so many other demands on I mean, not that the government will give it cash, but I think it would be unlikely. They don't want to increase taxes. And so increasing the licence fee would be seen as a form of extra tax. No, and so I think it's unlikely that... I think things will be easier, but I wouldn't expect that much. And maybe, I mean, if I had the ear of the government, if I was sitting with Keir Starmer, the one thing I would say is you need to take the World Service back into under-state control, and you need to fund it properly, as it was before. It's not fair on individual... Why should somebody in, you know, West London fund broadcasting for somebody living in West Africa, A, you know, and two, also, it is a tool, it's a foreign policy tool, don't mix them up. You know, obviously it has independent journalism and so on, but it's a very important tool of British soft power. And it should be funded accordingly, and not by a licence fee. And that would give the main part of the BBC an easier time if they didn't. I mean, because as I say, it's about £250 million a year, so it's quite a substantial sum of money.
Yeah.
That and the over 75s. In other words, yes. The two things that it's unfair. I mean, to be honest, I don't see why people over 75 should get free license fees. They tend to be a wealthier part of the population anyway.
They get free bus passes.
They get a free bus pass. I mean, the Finnish do a really interesting thing, which is give free license fees to people under 26. Yeah. And that, I think, is smart.
Yeah.
Because that, I mean, that's another thing that we haven't discussed, is actually the biggest threat, really, to public broadcasters is our lack of young audiences. Young audiences, young people under 26 don't tend to engage that much. You know, they're watching YouTube, they're watching TikTok, and this is an issue. This is a really big issue. We have to find ways of engaging with younger audiences. Otherwise, they're going to grow up without knowing public broadcasting, and they're not going to want to pay the license fee. So this is a big challenge.
I mean, we have to find a very good balance between traditional television programs and TikTok, so that you can sort of find ideas how people will actually be able to engage with journalism. But when on the height of the Brexit populists' attack on the BBC, your former colleague Emily Maitlis had a speech where she said that one of the people who were sort of brought in on the board in the BBC, Robbie Gibb, was sort of an agent of the Conservative Party. That was one of the most outspoken criticism publicly by, and she was former BBC by that point. Emily Maitlis is the journalist who made the interview with Prince Andrew, famously, after which he had to be parked in the stables and away from public office. And she left the BBC because it was so difficult to work during these years for someone who is, as she is.
Well, this is another way that the Johnson government sought to influence, if you like, the BBC. Was, I mentioned right at the beginning that the government can appoint 5 people to the board. And in the past, on the whole, previous governments, I mean, even Thatcher, would put in respectable people from the world of broadcasting who were not too divisive or whatever. But under the Boris Johnson government, they tried to put in a series of chairmen who were really not suitable, including this guy, Richard Sharp, who was a major Conservative Party donor, former Goldman Sachs, didn't come from that world at all, very friendly with Boris Johnson. And in charge of England, the nation of England, was this guy, Robbie Gibb. Now, Robbie Gibb is who really did interfere more than any other government-appointed board member ever has done before. And he's an interesting character, actually, because he's an ex-BBC journalist. And I always laugh when I kind of think, when people go, oh, the BBC's full of left-wing people. It's actually nonsense. The BBC, like any public broadcaster, recruits across the board. And, I worked in BBC newsrooms for 35 years. I've worked with right-wing people and I've worked with left-wing people. And Robbie Gibb, who worked for the BBC for many years, was always pretty right-wing. In fact, I would say he pushed the envelope too much, because we're not really, it's in our contracts that we're not allowed to join. We can join a political party, but we can't be active. Can't make speeches, no. Robbie Gibb was active in the Conservative Party. He left being a BBC political journalist to go and work for Theresa May. Yeah, he then gets appointed under their government to the BBC board, where he takes it on himself to try and influence, to shut up, basically, the left-wing journalists that he doesn't like. I was once at the theatre in London some years ago when he was still working for the BBC, and I went to see a play about, it was a comedy about Thatcher and the Queen called Handbagged. And it's a bit of a farce, really, about the sort of supposedly...
Who had a better handbag?
Yes, 2 women with large handbags who didn't get on. Anyway, at the interval, I saw Robbie, and he stomped out saying, I'm not sitting through any more of this left-wing nonsense. And I was with a friend. They said, who's that? And I said, that's a BBC journalist who's very right-wing. So you see? And he was in
taken.
charge of political coverage.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in fact, I mean, during my time at the BBC, I'd say I'd seen far more of my colleagues go into government working for the Conservative Party than for the Labour Party. There was a whole, I mean, it was a revolving door, basically, with Downing Street. There were a lot of them. So, you know, it is a complete myth. But it's a myth that you know, unfortunately, the right like to propagate. But
just before we round up and ask also for questions from our distinguished members of the audience here, one question that I think is very interesting also for people in Austria having the same issues with ORF is how impartial a journalist can be. As you say, you worked with left or with right-wing people. I remember that I was actually astonished, slightly naive maybe, when we made this activist group during the Brexit campaign that from European citizens living in Britain that was called Hug a Brit, and we invited Brits to hug, that we could hug them to show love of Europeans for Britain, because there was such an utter non-empathetic discourse going on in Britain about the EU, which was only about is it costly or not, and we wanted to show our love, and it worked actually quite well. People were very happy to be hugged, although they always said like, no, Britain don't want to be hugged, but actually, of course, they love being hugged.
Especially by you, Tessa. I think they love it.
No, but not only by me, believe me, we had lots of fun in these hug-ins that we made in parks in London and all this. And then we had a lounge party where we took pictures of these hugs and uploaded them. So it was a social media campaign. And so Misha and Kirsty, you both came along, and I was about to jump on Kirsty to hug her and pull her in front of the camera. And you said, I shouldn't do that because I work for the BBC and we are supposed to be impartial. And I said, but that's almost a question of conscience, to like the death penalty if you are for or against Europe. But you were very careful. And I understood that you take this, you take it very serious to not be seen as partial. You're taking it very serious to be seen as someone that can be trusted by all sides. So how can you manage also in a social media age, not to be discovered as maybe a liberal thinking person?
Well, I think it is a belief that I hold very fundamentally. I've spent most of my adult life in the BBC. I've been trained by the BBC. I believe in its mission. I believe in impartiality. I mean, to the extent I actually find it quite difficult to express an opinion publicly because it's so deeply ingrained. And this is something I really believe in. And I felt that if I was photographed at a pro-European campaign during a very divisive referendum, I have viewers and listeners who follow me who will have a different opinion on whether we should stay in Europe or not. And I didn't feel it was fair to them or right to the values of the BBC, an organisation which I respect and hold dearly. I mean, you're right, I'm like all BBC journalists, I complain it's not as good as before, blah, blah, blah. But essentially, I believe in the institution, and I believe that we can only exist and continue to exist if we are as impartial as possible, that we should not, of course we all have political views, but I don't think that my listeners or viewers should know my political views.
I mean, there's one famous case, and since there's a football, not world, but European Cup going on, we should mention Gary Lineker probably, because he became quite famous also outside of the borders of Britain for tweeting. And you know, Gary Lineker is one of the most famous football players in the world, and now a commentator on the BBC and other programs, and having a huge following on X at the time when he did that. It was still Twitter. And he said that the wording of the government's asylum politics reminds him of Germany in the 30s. And that was something that was...
He basically compared the government to Nazis.
To the Nazis. But he didn't do it in actual word, but it was sort of clear what he meant. And so there was a huge storm breaking out and a big debate, and they immediately pulled him off air and had not expected the uproar in the public after he said that, because that man is really loved by his fans as a former football player. And so there were so many complaints that he, in the end, was put back on the air.
No, well, the BBC, all his colleagues went on strike.
And everyone went on strike in between.
So in the end, that, you know, they all came out in solidarity. Look, it's difficult because, you know, Gary Lineker is a footballer. He didn't train as a journalist. He's not a journalist. He doesn't present the news. He presents a football programme. But, you know, he does represent the BBC, and that is an issue. It's not quite the same as if a news journalist, or, you know, like somebody like myself or Emily Maitlis or whatever, if we made those comments. But it's problematic for the BBC, no question about it. Gary Lineker is a problem for them, you know? Yeah. Because, you know, he says, well, you know, I've got very strong opinions, I've got all these followers, and I don't want to stay silent. And, you know, I'm sympathetic. It's not what I would do, but, yeah, you know.
So to round this up, basically, we have mentioned a few issues where the BBC, I actually thought on many issues, has done quite well. For example, adapting to this new technology. The BBC was very early on with the iPlayer, which ORF on came much later. And also the accessibility for people on tablets and the digital services was quite early on, also radio and television. There is an issue with how to be a credible source, which I think, as you just sort of showed, is quite a serious issue for the BBC, and it has not gone down in a wild blaze of sort of social media presentation of stardom, but it's quite seriously taken still. As a public broadcaster, it has also done quite well towards private TV stations. You know, when private television came up 30 years ago, we were all convinced that RTL and all these things, and in your case, ITV and others would just take over. Sky would sort of destroy the BBC. It hasn't happened. So maybe also the biggest populist wave is over, and the license fee is still there. It might, you know, the freezing might be over. We'll see. So there are few actually things where we could think maybe anti-beep will stay.
Yeah, I think there are reasons to be optimistic, and you know, as I said, I think there is. I think, you know, more and more people are waking up to the dangers to our democracy of this flood of disinformation, and so I think there is a greater understanding now of the importance of funding decent journalism, whether that's public service broadcasting or whatever. But I think, you know, I think governments and members of civil society, philanthropists and so on are really waking up to this. So, you know, let's hope before it's too late.